Elden Ring is a dark fantasy action RPG set in an open world. The latest game by From Software, the company responsible for making Souls-like games a thing. You've probably heard many things about Elden Ring already. After all, it won the award for most anticipated game at the Game Awards for not 1, but 2 years in a row. Everybody has been talking about this game. No matter how far you try to run from it, you just won't escape it. With every well-beloved game, there's bound to be more than a handful of people that don't share the same enthusiasm as the majority. So this isn't a typical review. This is to answer the question, is Elden Ring right for you? If you've been a fan of previous Souls-like games by FromSoft, then the answer is pretty simple. You're probably already playing and enjoying Elden Ring. This game takes core concepts from previous games in the Souls series and refines them. It's very much a if it ain't broke, don't fix it style of approach to game design. Elden Ring feels very much like Dark Souls if you set players in an open world and gave them a jump button. We'll get back to that open world in a second because there's a lot to talk about there, but for all the Souls veterans like myself, we can all just jump into the game and immediately be familiar with the controls. We know how to run, how to attack, how to backstab, what stats to look out for on weapons, and how scaling works, how to manage stamina in combat, how to cast spells, and so much more. Really, not much has changed from way back in Demon Souls. The average Souls veteran won't need a tutorial for controls and can just focus on new game elements, like riding your horse or figuring out Ashes of War, stuff like that. There are many complex systems in place here that things can become very daunting for someone who's completely new to the genre. I had a friend who's never played a Dark Souls game before. He picked a class that could cast spells and went for about an hour before I had to teach him how to use them. He also didn't know he could lock on enemies or how to run. Another friend new to these games also didn't know what the run button was. I was the one who had to teach both of them. It's not like Elden Ring doesn't have these tutorials either. It just kind of puts them out of the way so that they don't interrupt anyone who just wants to enjoy playing the game at their own pace. And this is great, but it unfortunately means that there's a lot of people who are going to make the game harder for themselves than it needs to be without even realizing it. And Elden Ring is already quite a difficult game. When the game starts, you get to customize a character, as well as choose your class and keepsake. You can always alter the appearance later, so don't sweat it too much. Your class only decides your starting stats and equipment. If you start as a samurai and later on you decide you want to use magic, nothing stops you from doing that. You can even respec your stats later on, though that process is a little more involved. Your keepsake is a starting item, some much more useful than others, but I ended up choosing a pretty useless keepsake that I wasted half an hour in, so none of these are really detrimental to your success. Combat is a heavy focus in this game. And part of why many people love these Souls-like games is the feeling of overcoming a tough boss or some other challenge. Many playstyles are viable in the game, whether you want to use a bow and stealth around, fight enemies while on horseback, cast magic, or just walk around with 2 giant shields. The game gives you the freedom to play the way you like. If you're a newcomer, it's probably best just to stick with the classic sword and shield combo, at least until you get a feel for how combat works. Maybe keep a bow on you for some extra utility if you need to attack distant enemies. Even as a fan, I always kind of wondered why people praise the combat of these Souls-like games. I mean, it's no Devil May Cry. I can't whip out crazy, insane combos that are stylish as hell. Oftentimes, things just feel way clunkier than they need to. But recently, it had clicked for me as to why I actually do enjoy the combat in these games, and I feel like it all comes down to enemy design. Enemies are so vastly different from each other, and have various strengths and weaknesses. Some will try to ambush you, while others are just big, scary, and intimidating looking. My favorite types of enemies are the unsuspecting ones. You know, the ones that don't seem obviously dangerous, yet you can't help but remain on guard because you're waiting for some kind of trap or something to happen. Fighting a new enemy always feels like a fun puzzle, as you try to figure out its attacks and when you have an opening to strike. This is why it feels so satisfying to overcome even just a single enemy in this game, even if they're not a boss. And if combat does get too tough for you, you can always call on a friend. Elden Ring does feature multiplayer, but it's always been more complicated than it needs to be. If you're looking to play the game with some friends and none of you have any experience with any of these Souls-like games, it's probably best if you watch a multiplayer tutorial. Which is saying something because accessing multiplayer in Elden Ring is easier than it's ever been in a Souls game before. To give you a quick idea, first, make sure you and your friends set the same password so you can guarantee that you connect with each other. Next, have the host of the game use a furl-calling finger remedy so they can see summon signs. This is a consumable item, and you can craft more after buying the crafting kit from the starting merchant. The other player uses a tarnished furled finger to write a sign on the ground, and the host should see this sign show up in their game as long as they're in the same area. Multiplayer is restricted between areas, so you can't travel from one side of the map to the other with your friends. Besides co-op, there is also PvP multiplayer you can access as well. I've always thought connecting to other players is a little more annoying than it should be, but when it works, it often works pretty seamlessly, and it feels great. Except for when it doesn't work, which happens more than I'd like it to. And exploring the world with friends is always more fun. Speaking of, after making it through the starting area, you finally reach the open world. The best and worst aspect of the game depending on personal preference and how you approach this world. This world is massive. Every time you obtain a new map, the world seems to double, triple, quadruple in size even. It's insane how big this world is, and very little prevents you from exploring the farthest corners right off the bat. You might decide to fight this tough-looking guy near the start and learn a pretty tough lesson. Maybe you'll follow the game's guidance north and make some actual progress. The first thing I did was discover a cave I felt like exploring. A big mistake. I hadn't yet unlocked my mount or the ability to level up, or anything really. The cave was a mini dungeon filled with tough enemies and a bunch of traps. I died in this place over and over, making no progress towards anything. It was frustrating and it pissed me off. But I was stuck in this old mindset where I felt like I needed to bash my head against the wall over and over again until I overcame this challenge. At any point, I could have left and reached this outpost with some checkpoints called graces nearby. I could have gotten armor, a better weapon, leveled up, and come back much more prepared to tackle this dungeon. That's the benefit to the open world. If at any point you feel stuck or overwhelmed, you can just leave and go anywhere else. If you're following the game's guidance, you'll eventually come across a boss named Margit, and you'll have to beat him in order to enter Stormveil Castle, which is where the game is guiding you to. But you can completely skip this entire castle by going through a side path that isn't too hard to discover. In fact, I went this way before ever fighting Margit. I was actually 20 hours into the game before attempting to fight Margit for the first time. If you explore hard enough, there's even a merchant in the game that sells an item which helps you stun Margit during that boss fight as well. The point is, if you ever feel stuck, just try exploring the open world. It rewards and punishes your curiosity in the most crazy ways. And much like in Breath of the Wild, if you find a high enough spot, or just carefully examine your map, you can probably pick out a dozen nearby interesting landmarks to examine. In both games, each and every place you check out will have something of value for you. The difference is, with Breath of the Wild, you generally know what to expect. A Korok puzzle, maybe a shrine, the best case being some new armor. With Elden Ring, the reward could be anything. Fancy swords, new spells, a useless pebble, maybe a shortcut to an endgame area. Some rewards might not have any immediate payoff either, so things don't become entirely apparent until hours later. I loved running around and finding all these cool things that some of them I had no idea what I'd do with them. The game also features legacy dungeons, which feel more like classic Souls-like games. Riddled with shortcuts to unlock and secret areas to discover, these legacy dungeons are a fantastic callback to FromSoft's creative and lethal level design. If for whatever reason you hate the open world formula, or are just sick of it at this point, I don't blame you. Open world games are draining. They're usually littered with pointless map icons and blank stretches of open space with nothing in them. You might not enjoy Elden Ring if you don't like open world games, but personally, I felt like this was one of the best designed open world experiences ever. Each location feels unique, and I was never bored with wandering around since there was always a dangerous ambush to keep me on my toes or a secret area to discover. I loved riding around on my horse and slicing through enemies as I galloped across the many roads. I spent way more time just exploring than ever following the main story. Speaking of, the game is story light and lore heavy, meaning there's very little in terms of cutscenes and forced dialogue. but tons going on behind the scenes. This world and its many characters have a story to tell, it's just that to uncover them, you need to read item descriptions, or discover hidden NPCs, pay attention to environmental details, and really search for these mysteries. If you like a game with a focus on story and characters, there's plenty to discover here. You just have to put in some effort to search for it. This may put people off, but I'm sure many YouTube channels will explain this lore for you. VaatiVidya has built his career off of doing this. And if you don't care much for the story, then ignoring it doesn't hamper your enjoyment of the game since it isn't something forced down your throat. So, to summarize, Elden Ring has a heavy emphasis on combat. Combat can feature multiple playstyles, whether you prefer swinging swords or slinging spells. Enemies are tough, but have their own weaknesses and openings to exploit as long as you take the time to study them. This means patience is a virtue, as you will die many times during your adventure. If you don't like difficult games with a heavy emphasis on combat, or don't have the patience to overcome these challenges by learning the ins and outs of fighting, then Elden Ring is gonna frustrate you. There's no difficulty select, no easy mode, so you have to take time to learn all these little nuances. Discovering new moves and overcoming tough challenges feels very satisfying though, and is why so many people enjoy playing these games. I really love Elden Ring's open world. I think it's one of the best out there, but I understand that some people just don't care for open world games. They think there's a lot of empty space or pointless wandering. With Elden Ring, I'd argue the complete opposite. I always felt value in exploring this open world, but it can get easy to lose your objective. If you enjoy more guidance like mission markers and a minimap, Elden Ring doesn't want to give those things to you. It wants you to lose yourself in this massive open world, and some people may hate that, but I kinda love it. I was always discovering something of value each time I explored the open world, never knowing just what amazing things I'd be able to find right around the corner. Lastly, if you enjoy more cinematic, character-driven games with mysterious stories, Elden Ring has those elements just buried in its lore. This means it's not a very cinematic experience, it's a much more gameplay-driven one. But George R.R. Martin himself had a hand in helping to create the mythos for the game's world. The lore here is very thick, and many people will come up with their own interpretations. If you enjoy a more casual game with a story that feels more direct, then Elden Ring might get exhausting if you delve too deep. Some of the stuff here is really fascinating though, and adds a whole lot to your journey through the lanes between. I've been loving Elden Ring, but you may not. And I hope this video helped you figure out if Elden Ring is right for you. If you enjoyed watching this, thanks. It really does mean a lot. I appreciate you and everything you do. Ciao.